여러분 안녕하십니까?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the DMZ Peace Zone Session 1 of the PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022. I am Park Se-jung. Very nice to meet you.
요즘 시기가 참 어렵.
We're going through a different time, but thank you very much for joining us despite many difficulties. I would also like to express my thanks to the online participants.
자, 그럼 지금부터
Now, let us begin the DMZ Peace Zone Session 1 of the PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022.
DMZ 평화지
In this session, we're going to be discussing the DMZ Peace Zone and Green Détente. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Kim Wangbae, Standing Chair of People for Earth, who will serve as a moderator. Please welcome him with a big hand.
네, 그럼 대표님께
Now, I will hand over the mic to Mr. Kim.
예, 금방 소개받은
As introduced, I am Kim Wangbae. I'm serving as standing chair of the People for Earth.
기후온난화의 시대 또
We're living in the era of climate change and biological degradation.
문제는 어느 한 국민
But this is a global challenge that cannot be addressed by any single country. This global issue encompasses and goes beyond the national borders, and it has become a planetary issue.
평화의 문제와
But I would also like to argue that this is related to peace, the issues and the nexus of peace and climate change, and the peace and ecological degradation. But as you may know, the international community is still dealing with struggle and tension and conflicts and confrontation. But without peace, we will never be able to address climate issues. And climate and ecology can only be addressed when we have peace.
우리가 아는 것처럼
In this context, the Korean Peninsula is a place where you can still find the remnants of the Cold War,
들여다볼 수 있는
and the Korean Peninsula is a place where we need to zoom in on to understand the relations between climate change, ecology, and peace. In this regard, we're going to be discussing this topic of DMZ Peace Zone and Green Détente.
스피커들을
We have invited very special speakers and a panel member. First of all, Professor Byongjin of Kyung University.
멀리서
Second, from abroad, we have Mr. Costas Professor of International Relations at the University of Cyprus, and Mr. Wooksik, Director of Peace Network, and Ms. Youngju, Attorney at Law at One Law Partners.
각 선생님들이 한 20분 정도
I would like to give each speaker 20 minutes for their presentation.
특별히 시간을 좀
I would once again like to ask you to keep your time limit of 20 minutes per speaker.
대학교 미래 문명
As the first speaker, we will be inviting Professor An Byongjin of Kyung University.
한반도에서의 어떤 그
On the Korean Peninsula,
정치로서의
concerning the biocracy, we have a presentation prepared by Professor An. Professor An Byongjin is a professor at Kyung University, and he also was the person in charge of strategies at Kyung University. And at the New School for Social Research, he received his doctorate degree on U.S. presidential elections, and he also is a awardee of various prestigious awards. So he majored in U.S. politics and Korean politics, and so he is quite knowledgeable about leadership in transition in both countries. And he is a well-known figure that appears very often as a columnist on various media outlets of Korea. Professor An, can you hear us well? Yes, I can hear you very well. So, Professor, we would like to ask you to limit your presentation to about 20 minutes. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Let me share my presentation slides with you.
예, 제 발표문 잘
Can you see my presentation slides?
발표문이 아직 잘 안 보여.
It seems that we are not able to see them. Can you see his presentation slides? Yes, we can see your slides finally. Yes.
예, 잘 보이시죠?
So can you see them well?
자, 그러면 발표
So let me start with my presentation. Yes, please proceed.
예. 제가 오늘 발표할
So today I would like to talk about
이라기보다는요.
a green détente.
가능하기
So it is talking about our ideology, our value systems that enable a détente. I want to review the circumstances for a détente, and I believe that by reviewing these circumstances, we can start our détente on a firm philosophical basis. So that is the approach that I have for this presentation. This actually is in line with the presentation by Dr. Hwang Jin-seok in session 3.
방법론적
So in that presentation, we talked about
사고의 틀을 이야기하셨.
a framework of thinking. And so what I would like to do is to talk about the philosophical platform for a détente.
하기 직전에
Before my presentation, I had an opportunity to chat with Dr. Constantinous before the session. And we talked more about the Ukrainian situation. That's because everyone is now focused on the Ukrainian situation. Unfortunately, it seems that we are envisioning a very dark scenario. In the 90s, we had an excessive expansion of NATO. This is how naive neoliberalism is. And this is colliding with the ambitions of Putin. Why is this important? Because in order for a green détente to be possible, whether it be authoritarianism, whether it be liberalism, we have to realize that all of these thoughts have limitations. And so the Ukrainian situation actually reveals a reality that makes green détente very difficult.
우크라이나 사태
And as we can see in the Ukrainian situation,
외교 안보의
the ideology fragmentation in each country is leading to a malfunctioning of diplomacy. And it seems that bipartisan diplomacy is becoming more and more difficult, which translates into the difficulty of achieving green détente. The Ukrainian situation also shows how difficult it is to transform into the climate regime. Well, in Europe, they have the issue of the natural gas system. And so it shows that it's very difficult to transform into the climate regime. And in the long term,
제도권
we also have to think about how the civic society needs to readjust their philosophical background. And that is the only way that a green détente would be possible.
그린 데탕트에 대한
And so, in order to think about a green détente, there are themes that we have to think about. Around the world, those who are studying international politics are discussing whether this is an era of new Cold War or not. We cannot say that it's not a new Cold War, but at the same time, it goes beyond such simply being a strategic war. And so that is why green détente is becoming very difficult.
협력적 아젠다
Climate, you may think, is a cooperative theme, but it's actually a little bit more complicated. At times, climate may not be a cooperative theme, but it's actually becoming a tool for hegemonies. For China, it's being used as a tool for hegemony, and for the US, it's being a tool to keep
또한
China constrained. And so that's why cooperation and collaboration is becoming more difficult. And the sanction regime designed by the US needs to be overcome in order to make dialogue on Green Détente possible. All of the dialogue right now is bottled up in climate and sanctions and COVID-19. And there is overly optimistic views that sanctions can be given up easily. And there's also dialogue within Korea that we need to have liberal spaces on par with the EU. But can we actually have liberal space for democracy on par with the EU on the Korean Peninsula? Well, if we think that everything is decisive, that's dangerous. But if we say that we have too much liberalism beyond what we can afford, that also is very dangerous. And so we need to have a clear understanding of our situation. And the last theme that we have to think about is concerning the future denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It seems that some people believe that a peace regime is possible, but on the other side, there are other people who believe that arms reduction in North Korea is possible, but a denuclearization with a peace regime is impossible. What we need to decide is what we wish to see, and we need to move in that direction. It seems that I'm being bleak about my future expectations, but the situation for a Green Détente is very difficult. Ever since the failure of Hanoi, it seems that Kim Jong-un has been realizing the difficulty of the international circumstances, and Hanoi and the Ukrainian situation is now showing everybody the importance of having nuclear weapons, unfortunately. And the role of South Korea as a mediator is becoming smaller and smaller. And in this great transition, it seems that U.S. is becoming less of a superpower, and that in itself has its ups and downs. According to some scholars, whoever takes office in the U.S., they have an impossible presidency, meaning that they cannot have full control of international politics as they used to. And after the general elections in the U.S. also has to think about the rebirth of Trumpism, as well as the heightening tension between Ukraine and Russia. And we need to solve these tensions in order to have a Green Détente, but we will see heightened tension before we solve these tensions. We have to think about the Cuban situation of the 60s. John F. Kennedy was fixated on the Cold War regime, and he was fixated on the thoughts centered around the Cold War framework. And at America University, he has a war after the post-Cold War, and this is actually deemed to be one of the best speeches of any president around the world because he expresses how we need peace. He says, "We all breathe the same air. Around the world, we all breathe the same air. And so we are a community of the same fate." And he actually realizes this only after World War III. So when will Biden actually be able to go through the post-Cold War rather than live in the Cold War framework? Putin, when will he actually become a wise Khrushchev? And Xi Jinping, in this situation of the U.S. on the decline, is being quite aggressive. When will he become a practical Deng Xiaoping? And when will Kim Jong-un become a communist that is on par with the communism of Vietnam? Unless we achieve these goals, it's very difficult to achieve a Green Détente. So it looks very bleak, but academic research these days, whatever your political affiliation, whatever your country's governance looks like, we have to focus on the devotion and consciousness of the citizens. And this is something that is quite well proven within the academia. On March 9th, we will vote for the next president of the Republic of Korea. The Latin origin of vote is devotion. And so, what are the citizens devoted to is more important than amending the Constitution. And this is the same for Green Détente. If the Green Détente is to continue, we need to have continuous devotion of the citizens. We need not only the contributions of the scientists, but we also have to think about the emotions of the people, going beyond their logical thinking. This is what we need to focus on. And quite fortunately, we are thinking about the peace treaty as well as various theoretical background for Green Détente. Recently, feminism is also being combined with coexistence and neo-materialism, and it seems that various theories for justice can function as resources for a Green Détente. And so, taking this into consideration, we will be hearing from Professor Wooksik and Ms. Youngju, and they will be talking about detailed agendas, and we actually have the theoretical background to combine the abstract with the tangible. And it seems that around the world, including Korea, including Israel, and other countries around the world, we are thinking about climate citizenship, and that actually is becoming a great theoretical breakthrough for a Green Détente. And I'm also a member of People for Earth, and Thomas Berry, he has a well-known theory for ecology, and his theory is the background for People for Earth. We also talked about these issues in the 3 o'clock session. The new peace treaty is not a treaty centered around people, but it is a treaty that is centered around all living things on Earth that is going beyond democracy, called biocracy. And when we have the viewpoint of biocracy in a civic society, then Green Détente can propel forward. And we can also imagine new things in the DMZ. I mentioned that even cranes can become stakeholders in this Green Détente. And if we take a look at materialistic peace theories, that actually inspired many people around the world. It seems that Baltung's theories are forgotten in Korea. With the exception of a few universities, we are not continuing to evolve academic studies on Baltung, but Johann Baltung is the source of these theories. And at first, it was very difficult to approach this from a civilizational theory by Galtung, but it seems that around the world, civilization and great transformation is at the core of all messages of leaders. Can we have a Green Détente by the policies of Biden? Can we have a Green Détente by having China at the center of the world as Xi Jinping is intending? We need to make sure that everyone realizes their limitations and come up with a common theory for peace. On the way to a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, one of the most difficult roadblocks is the different approach from the two Koreas concerning human rights. So this is very different because authoritarianism is not interested in human rights. Going back to Galtung, we need to find common ground from a civilization perspective. And so I have very abstract things that I'm sharing with you today. But the peace regime that we wish to create with the whole world on the Korean Peninsula is not based on past regimes, but it actually should include civilization according to Galtung. And it should not only include logical agendas, but it also should encompass logical aspects from citizens. I would like to name this biocratic emotions.
시민 감각 없는 미학 없는
If we have
어떤 아젠다란 없습니다.
an agenda without the emotions, without aesthetics, that agenda is not a living agenda. And so
미학에 대한 고민을 해야 될 때가
I believe that now is the time to talk about aesthetics. And I talked about the limitations of Western liberalism. In China, we talk about Confucianist constitutionalism, and in Europe, we talk about a system going beyond what we have today. We talk about the attorney of nature, sustainability councils. And so, we need to go beyond what we can normally imagine from democracy. Thomas Piketty pointed this out very well. The governance structure of well-known private universities in the US are not democracies, but we never call them not sustainable. They are actually very sustainable universities. Harvard is a very sustainable university, even though they are not using a democratic system for governance. And so we need to indeed widen our imagination. Of course, the current values will make it very difficult, but in the future, those who are outside of the mainstream will create that future. Thomas Berry is a scholar that People for Earth was very interested in, but nobody was familiar with Thomas Berry at that time. But currently in Korea, many people are interested in Thomas Berry.
오래전에 얘기했던 위기의
The Roman Club talked about how it is high time for new things to be born in crisis.
정교하지 않았습니다.
So, this means that it's because our views are not elaborate enough.
어떤 집단
And so, what we need to do is to utilize the energy, the collective energy that we have. And using this collective energy, we can dream of new things. I have 2 minutes left. And here are the 5 tasks for Green Détente.
이 코스타스 교수님과 정욱
And because we have Professor Constantinou and Professor Wooksik here today with us, we need to think about Green Détente in Korea. We need to think about biodiplomacy.
이에 대한 전문적 연구를
Well,
하고 있는 학자가
it seems that there are not many scholars in Korea who research these topics, and the research institutes are non-existent. And so we need to make sure that we collaborate with Professor Constantinou, and through think tanks, maybe we can have a crowdfunding for such a think tank.
마지막 결론장에서 메리 올
And in conclusion, I would like to quote from Mary Oliver, who is a poet. All forms of creation does not help with the world to move, but it helps the world move forward. And amazing things happen on the edge, and all of the attention is created into tangible results by working from the edges.
어떻게 보면
And so, I believe that
무정형에서 새로운 것을 만들어낼 수 있다.
we need to create something new from the intangible. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Professor An Byongjin was very clear in his suggestions and in his explanations with his very
체제를 벗어나서
clear voice. And so we need to go beyond the current democratic system to include all forms of life in the form of biocracy. In order to achieve biocracy, what we need are the emotions of the citizens. And as Professor An has mentioned, we need biocratic emotions.
혹시 이따 또 시간이 되면
If time allows, we hope to listen to Professor An again.
Next, I would like to invite Professor Constantinou from Cyprus, University of Cyprus.
교수님이십니다. 코스타스 지금
Professor Constantinou
콘스탄티누 교수님은 지금 현재
is currently teaching at the University of Cyprus. He is teaching international relations. So he's an expert on conflict, international relations, and international politics and law.
특히 평화와 관련돼서
In particular, he has been conducting research on peace and ecology.
오늘 교수님을
So it is our honor to have Professor Constantinou here in this session. Thank you for your participation. We are discussing this notion of Green Détente.
교수님이
And as Professor An proposed, I hope that we will expand our exchanges and cooperation with you and your research team so that we can develop our ideas. So, Professor Constantinou, please go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. Good morning from Cyprus. I'm delighted to join you again for this conference organized by People for Earth. Last year, I gave a more theoretical presentation. This year, I will give a more focused empirical presentation on the experiences of protecting the buffer zone in Cyprus. I really appreciate very much Professor Kyung his presentation just now, the discussion on Green Détente, which I missed in the earlier sessions, but the elaboration and the importance of actually developing ways of connecting peace building and environmental conservation is indeed very important. Let me share my screen first to help my actual presentation. Can you see my screen now? Yes? Thank you.
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
The United Nations buffer zone in Cyprus is actually a good illustration for the environmental challenges relating to peace building in divided countries and conflict zones. It has constrained human activity for almost 5 decades and has transformed parts of the buffer zone into a safe haven for biodiversity, which is, of course, an unintended consequence of the division of the island, very much like the division of Korea and the demilitarized zone. Note that this is in stark contrast to most of the island of Cyprus, which has been on the track of intense development and environmental degradation. Even in areas which have been designated for environmental protection outside the buffer zone, there are continuous pressures for the so-called benign development that is necessary to support liberal economy, real estate ventures, and the tourist economy in Cyprus. Let me give you some preliminaries to get you acquainted with the buffer zone in Cyprus, which was established as a ceasefire line on the 14th of August, 1974. And since then, it is under the authority of UNFICYP, which is the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus. The buffer zone divides the island into 2 parts. The southern part, which is controlled by the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus, and the northern part, controlled by the unilaterally declared and internationally unrecognized Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Consequently, the buffer zone provides a border between a de jure and a de facto state, the former state defining it as a temporary limit of authority, and the latter as an international border. And I think this is significant in terms of challenges of environmental protection and long-term conservation. The Cyprus buffer zone stretches for 180 kilometers and occupies 3% of the island's total land. In some areas, it is only a few meters wide, as you can see from the map, especially in the walled city of Nicosia, It might simply be a street separating the two sides, while in other parts, the width can extend several kilometers. There are even a few abandoned villages within the buffer zone, but also 4 fully functioning villages within the buffer zone, including a village named Pila, which is a mixed village where Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots live together. It's a very interesting place. And as a result of this exceptionality of the buffer zone in Cyprus, we have special arrangements that have been negotiated within UNFICYP for access to civilians, especially to their villages, but also for particular civilian uses that I'm going to show you now. You will see actually that unlike the Korean demilitarized zone, the Cyprus buffer zone is not an inaccessible, sealed-off area. It has certainly limited human access, significantly limited human access, but the United Nations has been issuing civilian use permits. The demining of parts of the buffer zone over the last years have made it even more amenable to human activity, including farming, grazing, and various activities, beekeeping, for example, which is now taking place in the buffer zone. In addition, since the opening of the checkpoints in Cyprus, this de facto border has opened up after 29 years of not allowing Cypriots to cross the buffer zone, except for certain humanitarian purposes. The opening of the checkpoints in 2003 has made it possible for security concerns to be significantly decreased and made the buffer zone even more accessible in particular areas. Okay, in some areas, tensions may persist, but overall, it's an area where if you have a civilian permit, you can very easily join enter the buffer zone. To that extent, contrary to, again, the demilitarized zone in Korea, local demands for access to the buffer zone increase and are being negotiated between property owners, local communities, and UNFICYP. Please note that the mandate of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus is not limited to the maintenance of peace. If you see the resolution of the Security Council that established UNFICYP, Resolution 186 of 1964, charged UNFICYP also as necessary to contribute to the maintenance and restoration of law and order and a return to normal conditions. And this aspect is very important, the idea of returning to normal conditions and the UN having a mandate actually to help civilians to return to normal conditions. Given that over the years, the Cyprus conflicts transformed from a violent to a post-violent conflict, at least with regard to physical violence, and UNFICYP is under constant local pressure to support the return to normal conditions, at least within the buffer zone, which it has actual control. UNFICYP has progressively done so, and besides agricultural permits, it has given permission for the building of houses, photovoltaic parks, a motorway, a mall, and even a British university. Although this situation should not be idealized, it is important to realize that the Cyprus buffer zone is not politically and socially static, but keeps changing under the rationale of normalization, the normalization of the conflict, the normalization of the conditions of living of individuals. From this perspective, and from the perspective of ecological diplomacy, there have been bottom-up and even top-down initiatives for the environmental protection of the buffer zone, and some areas have been declared Natura 2000. Nonetheless, environmental protection is considered challenging or not politically feasible given the lack of governmental control and the temporary character of the buffer zone, as I said earlier. Resisting a kind of a romanticized representation of the buffer zone as a sanctuary for wildlife, as an environmental heaven. Government officials, which we have interviewed, put it, and I have a quote here for you to see, in very unequivocal terms, clear terms, that we do not want to perpetuate a kind of a narration of having the Greeks living on the one side, the Turks on the outside, or on the other side, and actually having a kind of a peaceful, a Green Détente, if you like, a peaceful ecological space of wildlife thriving in the middle. This has been something that a number of people, including those who are interested in building conditions for reuniting the island, very much resisted this idea of kind of making the situation permanent. But let me give you one specific example of rewilding from a case where I have conducted research, namely the village of Varisha in the buffer zone, where nature took over following the forceful depopulation of the village in 1974. And the accidental creation of a nature refuge in the buffer zone around the village is a prime example of lateral or collateral conservation. This unintended conservation that can take place on the side of peacekeeping. It is linked to the emblematic mouflon, a wild sheep which inhabits the Troodos Mountains and is currently protected under Cypriot and European law. And while the mouflon was under severe extinction in the 1970s, it found shelter in the green corridors that emerged with the creation of the buffer zone. All of the inhabitants of this village of Varisha fled from the advancing Turkish army, and the village became an extension of its ecologically important surroundings, undisturbed by human presence, as well as agricultural activity. A 2010 biodiversity survey suggested that Varisha has the highest species richness in Cyprus, this area within the buffer zone. The existence of the buffer zone in this area has been especially critical for the success of the mouflon's breeding and protection programs. And in the late 1990s, the population of mouflons increased to around 800, from around 800 to 3,000, about 3,000 animals nowadays. Whilst the buffer zone ecologically helps the protracted conflict in Cyprus, does not allow for the close monitoring of harmful practices emanating across the Green Line, for the implementation of environmental regulations relating to the protection of the mouflons. So on the one hand, we have a very interesting attempt to protect the mouflons, but the condition of the buffer zone, which does not allow for proper governmental controls can create problems. For example, it is difficult to monitor the stop of illegal grazing of sheep from the one or the other side, which sometimes carry diseases and graze without permit and can create problems for the health of wildlife. Also, the other important question is, how do the internally displaced villagers feel about this? And I interviewed some people during my research, and I can tell you that they have mixed feelings over leaving their ancestral homes and habitats entirely to wildlife. You can see some villagers that I visited from a couple of years ago. I visited the village with them, with the permission that we got. And whereas for now, there are no plans for the return of the displaced inhabitants to their village and agricultural land, it will definitely create conservation challenges if this were to happen. The optimistic scenario will be that effective ways will be devised of cohabiting with the mouflons and wildlife, respecting the rich biodiversity of the area. But the pessimistic scenario, the more kind of neoliberal scenario, will be the granting of licenses for rapid development that will supposedly bring quick economic benefit to the local community, to displaced people, to people who have been disadvantaged, and this in line with development patterns elsewhere in Cyprus. So to conclude, the dilemmas that I have identified in the village of Varisha are replicated elsewhere in the Cyprus buffer zone. And from this perspective, ecological diplomacy creates considerable ambivalence. On the one hand, the conservation benefits are valorized, and quite rightly. On the other hand, there is pressure to so-called normalize the buffer zone, which is interpreted as allowing the kind of social and economic activities that are possible elsewhere in Cyprus. And to that extent, the buffer zone illustrates, I believe, the paradoxes of conservation practices in unintended ecological zones. The greening of the buffer zone is far from a straightforward peace-building affair. Entangled with questions of historical violence and injustice, its ecological benefit is predicated upon the continuation of human displacement. In addition, environmental policy and local interests and idiosyncrasies need to be conferred upon and negotiated given the status of the buffer zone, that is to say, as a temporary zone that someday will cease to exist come a comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus conflict. So peace as well as ecological discourses and practices, in this case, actively produce and reconstruct the social meaning of the buffer zone. This does not mean, of course, that conservation practices in the buffer zone are not significant or indeed supportive of peace building. Local environmental groups and activists, as well as a bi-communal technical committee for the environment, have flagged such conservation efforts, and this can indeed be a model of intercommunal collaboration in other areas. However, in the absence of a comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus problem, these projects have recently been scaled down because their primary goal has always been peace building, not ecological conservation. Ecological conservation was not seen as an end in itself, more as a means to peace building in Cyprus, to building building a peace between humans rather than a peace between humans and nature. In other words, the environment was not approached in its own terms and only instrumentalized in the context of interethnic conflict and as a means of achieving a Cyprus peace settlement. While not accepting the status quo as a solution to the problem, stakeholders, including environmentalists, connect the buffer zone environment with the wider dynamics of the conflict and highlight the continuous deliberation between transitional justice and ecological justice. To that extent, the violence or the justness of conservation in the buffer zone is diversely understood and talked about in Cyprus. For some locals, environmental conservation can even be seen as a new displacement, ethnic cleansing by other means, an insidious form of disassociating humans and national communities from their historical habitats, adding another layer of injustice. And this, as you can imagine, is a very serious charge and a very serious challenge for ecologists to respond to. They need to be able to do justice, ecological justice, whilst not doing an injustice to people who have suffered due to displacement. So for more ecologically sensitive humans, of course, the protecting of and the greening of the buffer zone is kind of ecological justice for non-humans that have themselves experienced violence in the past, both the fast and the slow violence of the Anthropocene, which, as we know, we can see it, of course, in the local, at the local level. Of course, we can see it globally as well. So for others, overall, which may wish for a more balanced approach, taking due regard of the history of interethnic conflict and the violence of interethnic conflict into account, conservation in the buffer zone ought to be the way forward, but assuming that it follows meaningful dialogue with local communities, the victims of past violence, and of course, it will require the consent of displaced humans who are part of the environment. Thank you. I think I will end here. Thank you very much for your attention.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. He discussed the implications of history and displacement, and he made a comparison between the DMZ and the buffer zone in Cyprus and all these potential possibilities that we can consider. Thank you very much for your presentation.
The next presentation will be by Director Wooksik of Peace Network, and he is also the person in charge of the 한겨레 Peace Research Center.
평화를 연구하고
He is researching people and peace, and he is a peace activist. And from last year, he has been serving as the director for the 한겨레 Peace Research Center. He is researching various aspects of peace, including the US-ROK alliance, as well as issues related to North Korea.
또 흥미진진의 핵의 세계사, 핵의
And he has written various books concerning nuclear weapons. Your presentation, please.
예, 따뜻한 소개 말씀 감사합니다.
Thank you for the warm introduction.
꼭 말씀드리는 것이
Well, I think I could deliver my message better if I take off my mask, so I will proceed without a mask. We have Governor Choi Moon-soon sitting in the audience today.
차를 타고 평창에 오면서
Last year and this year, I took the train down to PyeongChang, and my head was filled with various thoughts. We are living in an era of crisis, but in 2018, we had the peaceful PyeongChang Winter Olympics, and we have vivid memories of the Olympics.
오늘 행사처럼
In the South,
올림픽을 기억하고 싶은
we have events like today to try and remember the PyeongChang Winter Olympics. But in the North, it seems that they want to erase this memory. And so this actually feels quite unfortunate.
그리고 또 앞에
We have already heard from two presenters,
두 가지 역설을 좀
and it seems that two things are quite ironic.
우리가 냉전을
First, how should we view the Cold War?
설명이 가능하겠지.
It could be explained from various aspects.
핵무기를
But during the Cold War era, we need to remember nuclear weapons.
또 핵무기를
And the end of the Cold War also goes hand in hand with nuclear weapons. That is quite ironic.
쿠바 미사일 위기를 계기
We talked about the 62 Cuba missile incident, and that actually led to a change in thought by JF Kennedy.
핵무기가 늘어나고
So we have the expansion of nuclear weapons, and in this process, we start to realize that perhaps nuclear weapons may lead to the end of the survival of human beings. And that actually led to the Detent during the Cold War era, which brought about the end of the Cold War era.
그것과 연동된 문제로서
And in relation to that,
남아서 지구
nuclear weapons is a threat to the survival of human beings and the Earth itself. So the former Soviet Union and the US competed over each other, but they were able to cooperate because of this fear of nuclear weapons. If we take a look at the current situation today, climate crisis plays the same role. So everybody talks about how climate change can threaten the survival of human beings, and it can threaten the survival of the Earth itself. If so, then as nuclear weapons open the way for cooperation between the countries that were at war during the Cold War, can the same be done through climate change? Is this possible through climate change? If we were to make it possible, what do we need to do? But there is one decisive difference. The fear of nuclear weapons could be controlled, and it is reversible. So depending on what we do, the fear of nuclear weapons can be controlled, and it is reversible.
그렇지만 기후
But what about climate crisis?
넘어서는
If we go beyond the tipping point, once we go there, it is irreversible.
위기로 다가섰을
And so it will become an irreversible crisis. So we need to act before it is too late. And many people could relate to that.
DMZ와 한반도의 역설이
And we also have to think about the irony of the DMZ and the Korean Peninsula. You could have different views about the Moon administration's policies for North Korea. But in the DMZ, we do have demilitarization of this area as well as a more peaceful utilization thanks to various agreements between the two Koreas. We were able to take steps forward for denuclearization and peace in DMZ. But arms is actually building across the Korean Peninsula, with the exception of the DMZ. So we are adding more weapons on the Korean Peninsula. That is quite ironic.
제가 오늘 발표 주제가 그린 데탕트
My topic is Green Détente, and previous speakers also mentioned Green Détente. The expression of Green Détente came to mind last summer. It was around August. And as you're well aware, at that time, the whole world was suffering from extreme weather conditions. US and China were not an exception. And so climate crisis, it really is a threat to our very survival. That is something that I realized once again last summer.
기억하시겠습니다만 작년
And I do remember, and I hope that you all remember, that last year the heads of the two Koreas exchanged letters and the hotlines were reconnected. And we started to hope that inter-Korean relations would improve. But with the decision of the US ROK joint exercises, that actually failed.
기후위기와 평화
If we take this reality into consideration,
뭔가
I thought we need to have an expression that can bring all of these issues into one concept. And that is why I came up with Green Détente. It seems that around the world, the word expression Green Détente is not used all that often. But during the Lee Myung-bak administration and Park Geun-hye administration, from time to time, Green Détente was an expression that was used.
심각해지고 있습니다.
This was because the climate issue is becoming aggravated, and so if the two Koreas could cooperate over climate issues, then we could reduce tension between the two Koreas. So it's a very functional approach, and there was a big precondition. We need to solve the nuclear issue in North Korea.
근데 이제 제가 말씀
But the Green Détente that I am suggesting is very different.
군사 활동의 축소에서 시작되는 겁니다.
It starts with disarmament. It starts with reducing military activities to reduce carbon emissions in order to respond to climate crisis, and also so that it will translate into reducing tension. And I started to search materials and documents.
강원도 곳곳에도 군부대
So we have many military bases around this area.
전차나 그죠? 뭐
And so often you can see military trucks or tanks going by, and they do emit a lot of exhaustion gas, and that all equals carbon emissions.
전무하고 외국에는 좀 자료들이 있다.
I looked up some information, and I couldn't find this information for Korea, but around the world,
탄소량이 전
data says that carbon emissions from military activities is about 5 to 6% of global emissions. So that fact was something that I could search.
작년 11월에
So in November, President Moon went to Glasgow, and he talked about how we should have cooperation between the two Koreas for forestry by planting trees in order to cut carbon emissions. And when that suggestion was made in Glasgow, 200 jets from the US and Korea were in a joint military exercises in the air of Korea. And so
대부분 탄소량
the carbon emitted by these 200 jets, in order to compensate for that, how many trees need to be planted? And I calculated that, and it seems that we have to actually plant 450,000 30-year-old pine trees in order to offset the carbon emitted from 200 jets involved in the joint military exercise. So we have to look at these issues together.
이제 기후 위기 문제가 너나
When we think about climate crisis, we always think about how it is a common threat to all existence on Earth. In order to respond to that, we need bold political decisions. And at the core of those political decisions is that when we come up with any policy, when we implement policies, we need to mainstream climate change.
딱 하나 예외가 있습니다.
But there's one exception,
그게 바로 군사 활동.
and that is military activities. And that is military activities. And so I tried to look this up.
20년도에 그
In 1997, in Kyoto of Japan, the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated. And towards the end of the negotiations, the US starts to lobby and push
군사 분야는
so that military activities would be excluded from the Kyoto Treaty.
설득을
And so US starts to persuade their allies, and that is why military activities were excluded from the Kyoto Protocol.
하면서 미국의 군사
And in that process, there was a lot of lobby activities by US military organizations, and that was actually released by documentation recently. And at the center of these activities was Dick Cheney, who was the vice president for the Bush Jr. and also a minister during the Bush Sr. administration.
그리고 그런 것이 이제 나중에 문제가
And later on, that became an issue. Then we go to the Paris Treaty. And so partially it was reflected. But the conclusion is that voluntary reporting of military activities is possible. So that means that you can report it, but you can choose not to. And you do not need to have your figures verified because it's on a voluntary basis. So we can see two things. Military activities in itself
구멍으로 존재하는 거예요.
is a big loophole in climate crisis. So we are working to cut carbon emissions in all areas with the exception of military activities. And we have more and more military activities around the world. Look at the Ukrainian situation.
대비한다라고 해서
So we are preparing for war, and so Russia and all of the Western countries are mobilizing their military forces, and that all emits carbon.
정말
And if a war to break out, what about the carbon emitted during the war? And then also the carbon emitted in the reconstruction process. All of that adds up to immense amount of carbon emissions. So we always talk about a peaceful solution to the Ukrainian situation, but we also have to add the climate perspective.
생각을 좀 갖게 되는 것이고요.
Those are my thoughts.
이게 기후 위기 대처에 거대한 구멍이 되고
But military activities remain as a large loophole in climate crisis.
지구라는 행성이 마치
So on Earth, it seems like military activities are on a completely separate planet. That is the perspective that we have currently by excluding military activities.
또 말씀이냐면 제가 그 아까 우리 김영배 대표님
We also heard from
시작했는데
Chairman Kim Wangbae, and I became a peace activist a long time ago. And I don't think there has been any other time in history when the Korean people wish to become a military powerhouse.
더군다나 이것이 지금 문재인 정부 들어서
And during the Moon administration,
국방비 총액이
in the 5 years, the military expenditures
어마어마
is almost as high as the increase during the Lee administration and the Park administration. And now we have a record high military expenditure. We currently have the situation of COVID-19, which is a very severe crisis. And despite the severe crisis, we have the historically high military expenditure, but no one criticizes this. And if someone criticizes this, if I criticize this vocally and I openly, then I would be criticized by many people.
탄소를 배출하고 있다.
Military exercises have immense amounts of carbon emissions. If we become aware of this, then is there a possibility that people would change their minds about building military power? Well, that really is a totally different topic that I wish to discuss if there are any opportunities. Well, the younger generation, they have a very high awareness of climate issues, but at the same time, they have aspirations for Korea to become a military powerhouse. And if the two cannot go hand in hand, what would people say?
미중 전략
And if we take a look at the G2 competition, what would be the strategic choice of Korea?
예를 들면
For example, in the Taiwan Strait, if there were to be a military conflict, and if the US would become involved, I think there is a 90% chance that automatically Korea would become involved because you have the US forces in Korea. And if there is an issue in the Taiwanese Strait, the US forces in Korea would be involved.
선택.
and North Korea, they would also need to make a choice, because if they do not move, then that would impact their relations with China, their only ally. And if they would make a military choice, then they would get involved in this war, and that would mean that the Korean War would once again become involved in a war between power surrounding the Korean Peninsula. And that would mean that we would be sandwiched in this situation.
이제는 우리가 미국과
But now,
국제사회를 향해서
to the international community, including the US and China, we are in a position where we can suggest agendas. And I believe that that agenda should be Green Détente.
미국과 중국도 뭐 최근에 이제
So
나라들을 상대로 해서 우리가 얘기할 수 있는 단순
it seems that what we can say to Russia, China, and the US, the earth is becoming more and more difficult to live on.
경쟁을 멈추고
And so we should not fight over what we have on earth, but we should collaborate to make earth a better place to live. And we need to make a practical choice to reduce military activities. Now is a time for Korea to voice our opinions. I don't know if it'll work, but I think we need to have transitional thoughts in this aspect.
이건 당연히 국제적인 문제입니다.
So it's an international issue, it's a global issue, and it's an earth issue.
일국 차원의 노력으로 쓰는 게
And so it cannot be done by any single country. But I hope that we can start to form a consensus within our society and engage the world. Because Korea is an area that is very vulnerable to climate change, because the average temperature rise in Korea is much faster than other countries in the world. And Korea is where we have one of the most active military activities. If we take those two factors into consideration, whatever the way it may be, we need to voice our opinions so that we can all work together to reduce military activities in order to help respond to climate change through Green Détente. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So the topic is becoming quite passionate, but now we go to our last panelist. It seems that at 6:25, I need to end the dialogue, but because we started 3 minutes late, and because we are just about to go into these hot topics, maybe we can use a little bit more time.
Finally, I'm going to invite Ms. Youngju, attorney at law at the One Law Partners, and she's also a member of the Special Committee for Environment in Gyeonggi Province, and she has been participating in various forums on environment and ecology. And she's going to be discussing the legal aspects of the DMZ peace zone and Green Détente. I'm sorry that we're running short on time, so I hope that you can speed up in your presentation. Thank you. Hello, everyone. As introduced, I am Youngju Lee. I would like to express my thanks to the moderator and the speakers. I learned a lot from the presentations, and I was able to open up my eyes and saw from different angles. I'm also very happy to be part of this session that is very meaningful because we're discussing the nexus between peace and ecology. And I hope that my presentation will make a contribution as well. Let me share my slides.
네, 보이시나요? 화면?
Can you see my slide?
네, 화면 보이시나요?
Can you see it? Yes.
제가 오늘 발표할 부분은 이제
So in my presentation, I'm going to be discussing some legal aspects and legal issues. These may sound quite grandiose, but there has been lack of research on this topic. And as for this presentation, I just wanted to offer some food for thought because I want everyone to think about this aspect. First of all, we need to discuss the surrounding context of the DMZ, and we may discuss the DMZ and the surrounding areas, but I like to focus more on the DMZ itself. so that we can understand the legal issues that we need to address in realizing the DMZ peace zone and a Green Détente. This is a very simple fact, but as you may know, the DMZ was created as a result of the Korean Armistice Agreement that was signed in 1953, and it is often called the Armistice Treaty or the Truce Agreement. But you all know that the DMZ is located in the middle of the Korean Peninsula. But as was mentioned by Professor CONSTANTINOU, there is a buffer zone in Cyprus, and there's also something similar in Vietnam. So there have been many demarcation lines and demilitarized zones in many parts of the world. But nowadays, the DMZ has become more of a symbol of division because it has been in place for more than 70 years. And there have been very limited civilian activities in the DMZ, and that is why the DMZ on the Korean Peninsula has become very unique.
국제법적 위상이 무엇인가?
Now let's take a look at the status of the international status of this armistice agreement, but we need more research on this topic. This is what the DMZ looks like on this map.
그린색
The green line represents the DMZ, and we have the civilian control area and also the surrounding border areas. So overall, along this demarcation line, there are limits on civilian access and also human activities, and there have been many systems put in place for the management of this area.
사실 DMZ를 아우르는 법 체계를 저희가 이제 저는 이제
We need to take a look at the legal systems concerning the DMZ. I'm a lawyer, I practice law, so we need to discuss and we need to understand the legal aspects of the DMZ.
대한민국은 남한에 한정했을 때
This is actually only pertaining to the southern part, but we have the DMZ and the surrounding areas, and these are managed and controlled by separate laws. As for the DMZ itself, or the demilitarized zone, this is governed by the Armistice Treaty, and we have the southern part and the northern part.
이 비무장지대에 관한 대한민국의 법
In Korea, do we have a law governing the DMZ? It is actually there's nothing, there's a blank.
말씀을 드릴 텐데
So this is what I'm going to be discussing later, but as for the DMZ, within the Korean legal system, we only have the Act on Natural Environment Protection,
법률들은 존재.
and we have other laws related to the surrounding areas, especially the Border Area Protection Special Act and the Border Area Protection related legislations in place. But as for the DMZ itself,
관할권이 자연환경 보전법에 어떻게
we have some relevance in the Natural Environment Protection Act. And according to this act,
속하는 날부터 2년간이기 때문에
this law will be applied to the DMZ for 2 years after the authority is returned to the Republic of Korea. But as of today, the Republic of Korea does not have authority over the DMZ, so this act is not applicable as is right now. That is why I said there's no law that governs the DMZ in Korea.
우선은 이제 그린 대탕트라는
There have been many initiatives regarding the DMZ. There is something called the Green Détente, and there were also other previous initiatives starting from the 1980s.
가치를 무엇으로 보느냐, 산업적인 개발이냐,
You may approach the DMZ from industrial development perspectives or perspectives of human development or ecological conservation, but still you can see that there have been many DMZ initiatives. And I believe that there's something in common that we all wanted to promote peace utilizing the DMZ. And here what you see on the slide is the initiative proposed by the Moon administration. But during the Park Geun-hye administration, there was a proposal to create a peace park inside the DMZ. So in the past, we have had many initiatives for the DMZ. And I believe that these initiatives were well intended, and these were all good ideas. And if they became reality, it would have been wonderful. If I had time, I would be able to elaborate more on that. But I was actually involved in an attempt to create a conservation area or peace village inside the DMZ proposed by the Gangwon province. And I was involved in the legal review of such proposals.
좋은 아이디어들이 실행되고 있지 못한
There have been a lot of good initiatives proposed, but why were these initiatives not realized? It was actually partly because of the armistice agreement itself. As I mentioned before, there's no Korean law that governs the DMZ directly. And it is because of the limitations of the armistice treaty.
영향이 있다라고 저는 생각합니다.
There is an impact coming from this agreement.
국제적인 형태로 이게 이제 뭐 조약
The armistice agreement, whether this is a treaty or not, there's some legal dispute over the status of the armistice agreement, but this is indeed an international agreement,
관한 모든 것을
and this agreement is, in fact, the law or the agreement that governs the DMZ.
이 정전협정에 의해서 만들어져 있는
Now, this armistice agreement is in place, but when this was agreed, nobody thought that this would go on for more than 70 years, but it's been more than 7 decades. And there are about 60 articles in the agreement. So these articles are not comprehensive.
협정이
The goal or the objective of this agreement was to cease fire. So it was all about ceasing the military conflict. But this armistice agreement has been in place for much more than what was imagined back in the 1950s.
DMZ에 대한
So there are a lot of legal
발전이기 때문에
limitations, even though this agreement is the beginning of the legal framework that governs the DMZ. So you need to review the characteristics of the armistice treaty, and you need to think about whether Korea was a signed party to this agreement or not, and whether this armistice agreement is still effective according to international law.
이용이라는 표현은 이제 뭐 검토를 해봐야 될
And the term peaceful use in the DMZ or peaceful use of the DMZ, when we try to promote peaceful use of the DMZ, how much of an authority can be assigned to the Republic of Korea? So there are multiple interpretations, potential interpretations of the armistice agreement that we need to take into account, whether the Republic of Korea is a party to this agreement or not. Actually, by law, we are not an agreed party. It is the North Korean and the Chinese commander. But if you look at the interpretations of the legal scholars, the Republic of Korea is a de facto party to this agreement. But when it comes to the construction of the meaning and the interpretation, they may vary. And also the question of whether this armistice agreement is still effective or not. It is very limited, and there are some shortcomings and flaws that may not be able to govern many aspects of the DMZ that are relevant today.
유효한 질서인가라는 질문을
So the question of whether this armistice treaty is effective for the DMZ or not, this is a big question that we need to consider. But the agreement itself can be revised or can be replaced by an appropriate agreement for peaceful settlement. So there is a provision inside the armistice treaty where an appropriate agreement for a peaceful settlement can replace the armistice treaty.
설치된 감독기구라든지 이런 위협
So inside this agreement, there are some provisions about supervising committee and other organization for governance. These have not been applied. Then what will be an international order or an agreement that can replace the armistice treaty? This is something that we need to study further.
따라서는 좀
Also, whether we can promote peaceful use of the DMZ according to the truce agreement, this is something that we need to consider. When the armistice treaty was agreed, it was basically aimed at suspending all hostile activities and demilitarize the area. So at that time, there was an emphasis on the peaceful promotion or peaceful management of the DMZ.
행위가 아니
However, other than suspending military activities and hostile activities, can the other types of activities be allowed for the DMZ? There is a lack of interpretation because it is related to the definition of non-hostile activities, definition of military activities. These definitions need to be clearly agreed.
DMZ의 어떤 항구적인 보존
But let's say that permanent conservation of the DMZ and ecology, this can be interpreted as peaceful use of the DMZ. But inside the Armistice Treaty,
국제연합군 사령관이
the UN commander will be in charge of
출입의 문제인데
civilian activities. And also there is an issue of access limit. As you may know, the UN command has authority over access control. So even if we say that we can promote peaceful use of the DMZ, there is a limit as to gaining access to the DMZ, which is making it very difficult to carry out programs and activities in the DMZ.
그래서 이제 사실 국내에서 그 2020년에
In 2020,
비무장지대 보존과
the
평화
legislation on the conservation and peaceful use of the DMZ, which was tabled by lawmaker Chun Hae-chul, and there was discussion on this piece of legislation, and there was an attempt to legislate this, but because of the constrained inter-Korean relations, no progress has been made.
남한 측에서의 특별한 입법을 시도해서
And
법률을 만들
in Korea, there have been some attempts to create a legislative framework for the DMZ, and I believe that these were positive initiatives. But I think we need to consider different perspectives. I think that the National Assembly and the Korean government may push forward with legislation concerning the DMZ for ecological conservation.
쟁점이 있다라고 한다면
And also, there may be some legal controversies and issues given the domestic legal framework, because
그 존재로 만들어 나가기 위해서 평화지대로 만들어 나가
if we want to turn the DMZ into a peace zone,
있을 수 있는 토지
then we need to deal with land ownership issues inside the DMZ. We need to put in place some mechanism to settle any disputes over land ownerships. You may think that more than 7 decades have passed, so we may not have much of such dispute, but legally speaking, there may be disputes over land ownership inside the DMZ, and also if we are to pursue land expropriation, then you not only need a special act on the DMZ, but also you need to review and revise the law governing the land ownership and property rights.
그래서 지금 시간상 제가 이제 그
I don't have much time left, but this is a case study that we took a review. This was an idea to create an international tourism zone in the DMZ.
사람과 물건과
If you consider the DMZ as a single place for the movement of goods and people and wildlife, what would you need? We conducted a review on this, but in order for that kind of program to become sustainable, you need to think about immigration, you need to think about land use and access control. There were so many issues, complicated issues, and
이런 검토들이 이루어졌던 부분을 좀
there was some review on whether such an initiative could be carried out sustainably with North Korea. So you may refer to my slides for more detail. But in conclusion, we have the Armistice Treaty that governs the DMZ. That is an international agreement. And at the same time, we have the two states, so to speak. But by law, we are not separate states because we ultimately want to unify with North Korea. So these are complicated definitions that may come into conflict. And also, if there is this Korean government and the North Korean government, how are you going to address the sovereignty issues? I believe that there is many complicated legal issues that we need to consider when we want to use the DMZ for ecological or for other purposes. We need a comprehensive review, legal review, and I believe that we need an international agreement that can replace the armistice treaty. So that's one point. And secondly, we need a peaceful agreement between the two Koreas. But this is not enough. We need more, because we need to make sure that such an inter-Korean agreement is irreversible and is enforceable. And to do so, we need the support from the international community and support from the peoples of both Koreas. So we need both an international agreement and agreement between the two Koreas. And further down the road, we need separate legislation both in Korea and in South Korea so that we can have a fully functioning legal framework that can govern our operations in the DMZ. And this will require a completely new approach. With that, I'd like to wrap up my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. I wish we had more time for the session because there's a lot more we can discuss. This is a very important topic. I hope that we will find other opportunities to engage in this discussion.
Through this session, we talked about Green Détente as well as various situations surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So we did intervene too much on the part of human beings, and now we are changing the scene, and that is why we call this era the Anthropocene. But if we take a look at climate crisis and peace, we have a trilateral format. It seems that we need to engage the participation of all species, and we have to deal with the emotions of citizens by moving towards biocracy, which is a new form of democracy. Professor Constantinous talked about Cyprus, and we talked about the definition of justice from the traditional aspect and from the environmental aspect. Director Chung Woo-sik talked about how we always exclude military activities from carbon emissions. And so by reducing military activities on the Korean Peninsula, we can bring together the agenda of Green Détente by reducing military activities along with carbon emissions. We also heard from Ms. Lee Youngju. She only had a short amount of time, but a very rich discussion indeed. We need to make sure that according to international order and taking into consideration the situation on the Korean Peninsula, we need to create a peaceful ecosystem in the DMZ. So it seems that we're just getting the dialogue started, but we are out of time. And it seems that we are starting to have questions and food for thought, but we need to conclude here. Thank you very much to all of our participants and our 4 speakers. Thank you to our audience. We look forward to this topic continuing to be discussed well into the future. Thank you very much.